Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Your Legislators. I'm Anthony Morneau. It's great to be with you. On this program, we talk with state lawmakers from our viewing area during the legislative session. Joining us this week is District 36 Democratic State Senator Jeff Steinborn. Senator Steinborn, thank you so much for joining us for the program.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, Anthony.
Well, obviously the pandemic is impacting so much in our state, and I want to hear from you how you think the legislative session is going right now when so many of the proceedings are relying on legislative procedures to take place online.
Yeah, it's a little weird, participating in a bubble. We're meeting largely remotely via Zoom. So all the ambition to pass good legislation and fight bad legislation, it's all happening from the bubbles of our living room, and which can be distracting in a way. But nonetheless, I mean, we're still having the full legislative experience. I've introduced a lot of important legislation, and the legislature is moving through these bills. So, I mean, we're getting the work done of the state, and that's the important part. So we're getting it done.
Now, you've been a big advocate of transparency in government. I want to hear from you. Do you have any concerns about people being able to voice their opinions to lawmakers about the issues they're discussing right now with so many of these proceedings happening online?
No, I don't think we're any less transparent. I mean, all the legislation is online. People can participate. If anything, I think the process is even more accessible because we've set up this whole Zoom process where people can actually give comments online. That never existed before. And so now people can participate from all over the state, from their living room, and we have a system and attendants hired to take people in via Zoom. So who knows? Maybe that's kind of an optimization that maybe we can stick with when we get out of this pandemic world. But I think you lose a little something when you're not face-to-face having conversations. But having said that, I mean, certainly everybody that has an online connection anyway, which is something, is able to participate, and that's a good thing.
Do you have concerns about people not having that connection? Obviously, New Mexico is no stranger to the digital divide. So there are some that are concerned that if people can't connect online, their voices aren't being heard. What do you think about that issue, and how are lawmakers addressing it?
Well, I could be wrong, but I think it's kind of a non-issue. I think you can even call in to a Zoom feed without even having to have broadband. So I think as long as you have a phone line, you can do it. That's certainly a lower bar to participate than it used to be, where you actually had to drive to Santa Fe to be able to participate. So you would need a car, and you need money for gas and time. So I think that's the technology it's a low bar. Now, if you don't have either of those things, unfortunately, you're not able to participate, but you probably weren't before either. But so yeah, I'm not concerned about that. I do. It's interesting because the role of the lobbyists and the special interests, that is something that I think is more concealed in a way than ever before, because unless they participate online, you still continue to not know who's behind a piece of legislation. And I have a bill to try to change that. I've been working on for many years, to require every lobbyist and lobbyist employer who tries to influence legislation have to actually report that. So it's the unseen hand playing a role, writing legislation, trying to defeat legislation, pass it, that you don't see in this process, and certainly in this limited virtual world, you also don't see it. So that's something I'm trying to change.
So if people want to stay updated on what's happening with the state legislature, how can they do that right now? By simply visiting the website. I mean, they can obviously tune into meetings on this website that are happening live, but what are some ways that the state legislature can become more transparent so that New Mexicans can access the information and find out what lawmakers are talking about?
Sure. Well, everyone should get familiarized with the legislative website, which is nmlegis.gov. You can watch hearings in real time. Those hearings are then archived for 5 years. You can see exactly, you can look up bills. I think you can put in keywords and even track bills. You can see exactly what committees bills are assigned to. And then all the committees list all the members. And then when it lists the members, there's a link to our actual, we each as legislators have pages that you can see, get our contact information and email us. So it's actually a great interactive tool for you to track issues, to track your legislators, and then to watch them in action through the webcasting or through archives so you can evaluate their performance. But don't be afraid to engage it. I mean, we're very, very accessible. You just have to take the time to familiarize yourself with what's going on, and then send an email, make your voice heard. And believe it or not, it does make a difference. And our phone numbers are listed there. So nmlegis.gov, that's the great portal for folks to engage in.
I want to talk with you about some legislation that you're working on, and one of those pieces of legislation is to create a radioactive waste task force in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Tell us about this bill and why you decided it was needed in our state.
Well, there's a proposal right now to store the entire nation's supply of spent nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste, primarily it's spent nuclear fuel sitting next to nuclear power plants around the country. And there's a proposal to ship all that waste to New Mexico and store it here for what they call an interim storage facility, but a 40-year license with no end in sight. When WIPP was created, the Waste Isolation Energy Plant, Storage Plant, the Department of Energy low-level nuclear waste facility that's in Carlsbad, a lot of people have heard of. When that happened, we passed a law back in the late 70s, early 80s to create this task force to get the state government organized, looking at the impacts of that waste to the state of New Mexico, and to negotiate with the federal government on all issues related to it. So even though that task force, WIPP has been here a long time, I thought the model of getting state agencies to work together to look at the impacts of private waste facilities, which this law that we passed before only deals with federal facilities. What we're dealing with this high-level nuclear waste is a private company. I thought that we had a blind spot in New Mexico, that we did not require any serious look at the potential impacts of our public safety, of our environment, public health, economic development if there were to be an accident. And so this task force, what this bill does is it kind of amends that task force model to include private storage facilities of high-level waste. And it doesn't give them the authority to negotiate on our behalf, but it does ask the state government to look at all the impacts of a proposal like this to the state, and then to report regularly to the legislature. And that seems like a really prudent thing we need to do to look out for the citizens of New Mexico.
Another piece of legislation that you're working on is to increase penalties, environmental violations, penalties for those. Now, how does New Mexico do when it comes to environmental regulations, in your opinion?
In some places we're probably stronger than others when it comes to some of our fees and penalty structures, which is, the, I guess, threat, you could say, hanging over the heads of polluting industries. They have not been raised in many years. And so what the, I think, attempt to do here is to raise the upper limit of what a polluting industry can be fined for violating our Clean Air Act or our Clean Water Act. And, those disincentives to not pollute are only as strong as the penalties that someone could face. And so it's important to have a meaningful penalty regime in place to keep people to do the right thing and protect New Mexico's air and water and land when they do business here. And so this bill, which I'm co-sponsoring, would raise those upper limits.
How do you create effective regulations to ensure that you can still have a good, strong economy, but also protect your environment? And how can you make them sustainable? Because there's always going to be new administrations coming in to New Mexico, and they're going to have different ideas when it comes to this issue. So how do you create a sustainable way to enforce environmental regulations in New Mexico?
Well, I think first of all, what we need to understand is that my personal philosophy is that we should never trade our public health or our drinking water for a buck. We should never make that sacrifice. So I think when you have a financially viable resource, whether it's being mined or drilled or whatever the case is, that may produce pollution, then it's got to be economically viable to be done in a way that you are also protecting New Mexico's environment. If it is not economically viable to do that and without polluting our air or water or land, then frankly, I'm not interested as an elected official. I'm not interested in making that deal and selling out the health and the environment of New Mexicans. And oh, by the way, for the job that ends up polluting that same worker, whether it's a coal worker or a uranium worker, whatever, that's talk about making them a sacrificial lamb. I don't think anyone, they may need a job, but I don't think anyone wants to give themselves cancer in the pursuit of a job. So the sustainability aspect to your question, which is a good question, has to be the regulation itself. It has to be that we're going to recognize we do have some natural resources here and we do need jobs here, but we're going to set rules of the game such that we're going to protect our air and water and land, and that makes it sustainable. If you have lots of pollution and you create things like the sinkhole in Carlsbad that cost us $50 million, or the Gold King mine spill, and because you did not regulate it, because you thought, you listen to those voices that says, oh, we have to take it easy on industry, that's not sustainable, because you're setting yourself up for environmental catastrophe and doing a lot of harm to the state. So
what about when an industry decides that they're done doing business here and they leave? How do you ensure that they can be held accountable to hold up their end of the bargain to ensure that our lands and our waters are going to be protected, long after they leave and the system's set up in place?
It's really important, and a lot of these types of environmental activities where there is remediation needed after the activity, it's very common to require bonds so that they set up these financial surety instruments so that when they close down, even if they go out of business, that there's a pool of money there to do that remediation. They require that often in the mining industry, and they're looking at that and abandonment of the coal plants up north, and even in this nuclear waste deal that's being proposed in southeastern New Mexico. So that's really important, though, that you do have that contingency plan in place for if they go out of business or leave the state, who's left to hold the bag. And man, we have a huge problem in the state with our uranium mines. Back when we were, doing all this uranium mining to create the nuclear, nuclear weapon force that we have here in the country, we have all these abandoned uranium mines that now we have to babysit for years, and it's not a good way to do business.
All right. So, I want to talk with you about additional legislation you're involved with, SB 83, the Local Choice Energy Act.
Yeah.
Is this going to allow communities to start their own utility?
It could. So right now, we are all pretty much beholden to one energy provider. In our community here in Las Cruces, Doñana County, we have to use El Paso Electric. And then that flows from that a regulatory structure through the PRC, and they really, control the rules of the game, and they get paid on building more infrastructure and more power plants, and they fight everything that could produce more efficiencies to reduce the use of energy because they get paid on building more infrastructure, which I think is really a fundamentally, counterintuitive to the interest of New Mexicans. So what this bill would do is it would allow local communities, counties, and tribes the opportunity to purchase energy from whoever they want for their communities. And that would include a city like Las Cruces creating its own public utility, going into the energy business. It's done all over the place. In fact, here in New Mexico, the city of Farmington does that, and their energy rates are much lower than the rest of us pay. There are cities like Austin, Texas, who have great public utilities that keep energy costs down. And then the model flips on its head, in which case your incentive is not to produce more energy, it's to conserve energy and to limit the construction of new power plants and hence new costs that have to then pay that off. So it's really unleashing a democratization of energy purchasing, and that's what I'm trying to do with Senate Bill 83. It passed its first committee, Senate Conservation Committee, which is very exciting, and now we're waiting on a hearing in the Senate Tax, Transportation, we renamed it, and Industry Committee. So there you go. So that's your first piece of homework to your listeners, is you can go online and you can send an email to members of that committee if you support that bill.
So how are other states doing something similar? What do you know about what we've seen with legislation like this in other states?
It's called community choice aggregate. Community choice aggregation is what it's known by nationally. There's 9 other states that allow this, and it's working well. There's facets of what we've learned here in New Mexico on how things to watch out for. But generally speaking, where there's community choice aggregation, where local communities have this choice, they end up with less expensive energy and greener energy. Because I think a lot of communities would really want as green energy as they can get, which is sometimes the cheapest energy out there. And this would really unlock the full potential of that opportunity.
What about the technical issues that come along with this? What are some things that we need to consider if this is adopted and put it into place?
It's really important that we have reliable energy. Obviously, I think that's the most important aspect. That whoever is our energy provider, when you turn on the light switch, that it works, or the heater, that it works during a storm. And so our legislation has provisions in there requiring reliability. Proof of reliability. We're actually strengthening that section of the bill to add even more stuff. So that's number one importance to me, technical requirements. And then there's just facets of the bill, like when a provider is replaced, then they are entitled to what's called an exit fee to recover their investment costs that they may have made to service that market in good faith, understanding that they were going to service these customers for however long into the future. So it's appropriate to reimburse them and to keep them whole, so to speak, for those costs in a reasonable way. That's a really important aspect. It's called an exit fee to get right, so that it's reasonable, but it's not so unreasonable that cost stacked onto the new cost of the new provider make it such that it's no longer feasible to choose a new company. That's an issue that I know in some states they've wrestled with, and that we're trying to get the right language in this legislation to allow for reasonable but not excessive cost recovery.
So currently, an electric utility or provider, could they charge their providers here in New Mexico for costs that they may have to put forth in other states?
No, it would be like if they were replaced. In other words, if you had a provider that was replaced by a local choice program, no, the cost that they could pass on to the local customers that made that choice to replace them would be the reasonable cost borne out from them losing those customers. The reasonable costs related to investing to service that customer base. And actually that process would be determined by the Public Regulation Commission.
Okay.
And the bill that we've written talks about reasonable and appropriate cost standards that are in the public interest. And there's good consumer protection language in the bill.
Okay, I want to move on to more legislation you're working on, and that is dealing with minimum wage and secondary students. Tell me about this bill that you're working on and how you think it could impact the young workers.
Yeah, so when we increased the minimum wage in New Mexico several sessions ago, we did a good thing. I mean, the minimum wage was stuck here in the state at $7.25 an hour, very much a poverty level wage. And we put it on a trajectory to climb to $12 an hour over several years. Right now, I think it just went up to $10.50 an hour. Unfortunately, there was also a loophole put in that bill to exempt out high school workers, that if you're enrolled in high school, that your minimum wage was set at $8.50 an hour, never to go higher. And that means that if you hire a high school worker here in the state of New Mexico, if they're willing to work for it, you don't have to pay them more than $8.50 an hour. Whereas if you go hire a single mom who's putting food on the table, you have to pay her $10.50 an hour. So I think it's extremely unfair and bad policy from a variety of standpoints. Number one, I believe those young workers are working every bit as hard and valuable as any other worker. I mean, you have good and bad workers, but number one, they're doing the same work. They deserve to be paid the same wage. Number two, and they are also providing for their families in some cases. They're saving money for college. So they're having to work as many hours as it takes to maybe pay for that college. And so again, they deserve to make the same wage for the same work, to have that same opportunity. Number two, though, as our wage goes up, our minimum wage goes up to $12 an hour, what are we incentivizing employers to do? We're incentivizing them to not hire older workers so they can get as many high school workers as possible and pay that $8.50 an hour. So that then hurts families and single moms trying to provide for their kids, work in service sector jobs. And so I tried to actually pass an amendment on the Senate floor to get rid of that loophole. When we passed the minimum wage, I was unsuccessful, and now I'm taking another crack at it.
Okay. We'll keep updated with that. I want to talk with you about another initiative you're working on, and that is to establish a public bank in New Mexico. Tell me why you think New Mexico needs a public bank.
So this is a really innovative, interesting idea that people have talked about here in the state for many years. 100 years ago, the state of North Dakota created a public bank because they were having problems with banks getting liquidity, getting funding available to their agriculture sector, and a lot of instability in the national economy and similar things, frankly, that we've experienced, in current times and in the past. And what this public bank does is it uses it leverages the public funds, our tax dollars, and instead of putting them in a commercial bank and parking them somewhere and then paying fees on that, we're putting them into our own financial instrument that allows us to then loan that funding to whatever activity is advantageous to move our state forward. In our case, we write into this bill that this public bank should support everything from emerging businesses to community development, whether it's broadband or affordable food supply, renewable energy. So to create jobs, to support communities, and then, oh, by the way, the bank is then keeping that interest and those fees. It's growing its principal. It's then able to do even more. So it's just a way of using public money for public purposes. And why do we need one? Because there's plenty of areas in New Mexican life and New Mexican economy for New Mexico small businesses where they don't have access to capital, where we have community needs that aren't addressed by banks and may not be addressed by other state programs that have funding and, will loan it out. And even then, those are funds. When the money's gone, the money's gone. So, I think our state would benefit from having another option that could also play a very helpful role in meeting our economic needs and our community needs, as long as it's done right and it's done well. And that's really the challenge. It's one thing to say something like that. It's another thing to create a piece of legislation that would do that and protect the public money and make sure that it's secure as it would be if it were in a bank, and that it's professionally managed. And so that's a very high bar to create a bank that does all those things and yet still achieves all those lofty goals. So I've been working very hard this last year to write such a bill with a lot of different advocates. We've run it by a lot of different, the main financial heavy hitters in New Mexican life, from the state treasurer to the state investment council and the state economic development secretary. And so anyway, folks can look up that bill and read more about it, and I welcome your feedback. And that's Senate Bill 313.
I want to talk with you about another issue. We just have just over a minute left, but has this pandemic affected how lawmakers are viewing the way our state legislature is set up and how often it meets?
I don't think so. I mean, the same old issues apply. The same old concerns apply. Do we meet often enough? Do we meet long enough? But you've had some people saying we shouldn't be meeting right now at all. I personally believe it's super important that we are having a session, but that it be done safely. That we have to walk and chew gum. We have to deal with the adversity that we have right now and still move forward at our state. And that requires us to be focused. And that's what I was saying when we started. Even though we're operating from the bubble of our living room, you got to keep your head in the game and still try to do all this really important legislation that moves the state forward, because the pandemic will end. And but certainly our state needs. There's lots of reform that's still needed, whether it's full disclosure of lobbying or how we treat legislators, how we recruit legislators. And so those are all really important conversations to have too.
Okay, well, we want to thank you very much for joining us on your Legislators. District 36 Democratic State Senator Jeff Steinborn, again, thank you very much for your time.
It's been my honor. Thanks for having me.
And we want to thank you for joining us on your Legislators. I'm Anthony Murnau. We'll see you next time.